Well, hello everybody. Welcome back to Friday and welcome back to Leo Zagami. We have missed you, Leo, but Leo is still in the back room, sorting something, sharing our show. Thank you, Leo. But before I bring him on, let's just chat about some of the things happening on ARA for the rest of the weekend. Okay. Well, guys, if you haven't caught the earlier shows this week, they really were great. So Beverly Rhodes, we were doing a deep dive on her with the Royals because she had a lot of dealings with the Royals. So protocol and all sorts of deep dives into Andrew and Fergie. So catch that as well. Jamie J, brilliant researcher. And of course, the relaunch of Solutions with Shanti. Yay. Gary Wayne, Jesse, Penny Bradley, and of course, tonight, Leo. And then we have Jerry Marzinski tomorrow, 6 o'clock. And then Sunday Loop, and of course, Jesse's Patreon book club. So, again, for any of the members who would like to join the Patreon book club on Sunday with Jesse, we have Morna has sent out a post, I know, for the members to give you the link for the Patreon if you want to join us on Sunday. So you guys are welcome to join us for that if you'd like. Anyone, any of the members like to join, you just email us and we will make sure that you are there. And then, of course, what I want to just mention as well, Monday, awesome roundtable with Rachel Ward, Kathy O'Brien, Juliet Engel, Beverly Rhodes, Danny Henderson, and myself. So catch that at 3 o'clock on Monday, Central African time. Yay! Got a whole lot coming up for you guys again in the next couple of weeks. So stay tuned. And without any further ado, ta-da, our favorite Italian.
Hello
How are you
there.
here?
How are you guys? Missed you, and I'm glad to be here with a new book once again.
Yes, yes. I am so surprised that your new book is out. I was like, wow, that was
Yeah.
quick. But
Ooh,
we
yeah.
we were just we were just having a
Oh,
little. Oh, sorry, carry on.
it's
The-
here, physically here. So actually, it's out and about, and it's already drawing a lot of attention. Number one new bestseller in the history of Judaism, also in espionage accounts and other categories of the Amazon book list. And we definitely coming out at a pivotal time in the history of the Epstein saga. As you know, Prince Andrew has been stripped of his last remaining titles. There is a lot of talk for years about Jeffrey Epstein, but this is the first and only book that actually brings you to the ancestry of the protagonist, to the really in-depth view that only I could put together, because it needs a little bit of insider knowledge as well as knowledge of Judaism, which is a very complex matter for people who are not Jews. And I'm not myself, I have just a small bit of Jewish blood. I'm not really a practicing Jew in any way, shape, or form. I'm a Christian. But I wanted to challenge those people who, from within Judaism, from within the Jewish community, have been their worst enemies. And that is the Sabbatean Frankist sect that, unfortunately, for the last few centuries, has in some way changed the course and the history of Judaism. But then, of course, this book brings you a new perspective, because you are mixing, you are basically drawing from a contemporary account of course, criminal endeavor, like what Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell were conducting. And I kind of take the inspiration from there to then go into instead a much more vast story, which then brings you finally to understand who were the people behind Jeffrey Epstein. Because many times, and I stress that also in the introduction to this book, we find ourselves with the usual question: who is behind Jeffrey Epstein? Who is this mysterious group of people who have facilitated his rise and who eventually, of course, abandoned him during his fall? And that is something that no other journalist has done. So I'm very glad to say that I received already the compliments of fellow journalists who said this work is critical and unique because there has been thousands and thousands of articles written on the topic, thousands of shows on the internet, books, and so on. So people will wonder, what do we have to add to the Jeffrey Epstein story, But we really, when you actually go and look deeper into it, and the protagonist, from the family of Ghislaine Maxwell, the father, the family that we know as Maxwell, but in reality it's the Hawke family, or the family of Jeffrey Epstein, which is the Epstein and Stokowski families. Well, these families come from a specific part of Europe, which is a part of Europe which was touched by the Sabbatean Frankist heresy, which for non-Jews is very rarely discussed, because, you see, in the end, this book is important because with the growing anti-Semitism and with all the misunderstanding about Judaism, the Jews are the first victims of their own people who are behind this plot. When you see, for example, the level of hate which is increasing even domestically here in the United States against the Jewish people because of what is happening in Israel, we need to understand who is behind it and how the Likud party, for example, of Benjamin Netanyahu came together, how a former prime minister, Ehud Barak, violently and savagely raped Virginia Giuffre on the Little St. James Island, and why, and who, because the journalist, and I repeat, you can go on the internet and find 1,000 podcasts, but every single journalist, even the most, upfront and bold, at one point says, sorry, I can't go beyond this level because Jeffrey Epstein was involved with the intelligence community. Jeffrey Epstein was involved with the royal family. Jeffrey Epstein was involved with the elite. And so it's like they always give you a half history, a half story, concocted, of course, by the evidence, which is also what I'm trying to do here. But my evidence is also of an historical nature, of a religious nature, of an anthropological nature. So today is, of course, the day that, generally speaking, we dress up as monsters, and it's Halloween, and it's, of course, there is a whole occult background to this festivity. And I wanted to really bring out this book with Frankenstein Epstein, because this book makes you understand how they constructed this monster. Because Jeff himself wasn't a product of simply his, his knowledge about this or that, or his acquaintance with this or that. It was an upbringing that facilitated his connections to a sect, which is rarely discussed, if not in the media. And when it's rarely mentioned, I mean, I remember the last time I heard the mention in a sort of popular show was with Candice Owen a couple of months ago. And I was actually writing the book, and I suddenly heard Candice saying, oh, the Sabbatean Frankists. And she actually mentioned a couple of things which are relevant in regards to the Sabbatean Frankists, the connection to the Asiatic Brethren. And I was quite surprised. But then soon after, Nick Fuentes, who is today very popular here in the United States, who is a rabid anti-Semite, immediately went on the attack, meaning that you need to distinguish here between a race and an ideology and a religious, let's say, sectarian thing that happened to the Jewish faith in the last few hundred years. They got taken over by this sect. But if we know nothing about the sect, if it's rarely discussed by anybody, even within Judaism, you see, I have to thank those Jewish friends of mine who during the course of the years gave me the possibility to access to information regarding the Sabbatean Frankists. Today, the Sabbatean Frankists are not formally known, but they have derivatives within the present Jewish culture that are their product. I mean, even the state of Israel was defined by my late friend Barry Kamish, who was a very knowledgeable individual and investigative journalist. He said Israel is a Sabbatean state. Now, that doesn't mean that Israel doesn't have the right to exist, because today, if we start saying from the river to the sea, we have to understand that before the establishment of the State of Israel, the Sabbatean Frankists created the actual basis for pushing all these Jews towards this land, literally pushing them. I mean, at one point during the Holocaust years, there were Jews who wanted to come to America, wanted to go to other parts of the world. They didn't want to go to Israel. They got stopped, sent back to Germany, and then there was a transfer agreement made by the Zionists and the Nazis together and said, you have to go to Israel. Now, that means that they are the victims, the first victims of this sect. And it's very unjust, I think, that today, we have generally a sense of growing anti-Semitism that can't be stopped, and it's actually encouraged even by the actions of people like Netanyahu. So we need to understand, for example, when it comes to Benjamin Netanyahu, his party is the Likud party, and the Likud party is so as a conservative force within Jewish politics. It was this guy here, this gentleman here, who, this Russian Jewish leader and founder of the Zionist revisionist movement, who in the early 20th century launched this conservative force, whereby at the same time the Sabbatean Frankists were launching on the other side the liberal and progressive side of Judaism and Zionism with the labor Zionists. So you understand here, it's like playing God and creating the two opposites that fight each other. You see, on one side you have the labor Zionist, on the other side you have the revisionist Zionist. And together they become the only political alternative that people know in Israel. And today, in modern Israel, very few people know about the Sabbatean Frankist heresy. It's very rarely discussed because it's inconvenient, especially for those rabbis who have been compromised in the last few centuries. You see, in the history of Judaism, you have lineages of rabbis who transmit their knowledge through rabbinical schools. The moment in which a rabbinical school is compromised, it's obvious that then the whole lineage gets compromised. So they will never admit that their teacher, this or this other rabbi, were actually secretly Sabbatean Frankists, because it would destroy their whole rabbinical school. And for that reason, I had to be even more responsible in writing this book with credible sources that couldn't be debunked. When this book yesterday arrived to be the number one book in the history of Judaism, and my friend Roseanne Barr wrote me a mail, we absolutely have to have you on my show. And it's like becoming a phenomenon within Judaism. That is something very important. Because you see, in the Gospel, it says, that there will be false prophets. And those false prophets have been not only present within Christianity, but also within Judaism. You see, 2,000 years ago, Judaism didn't accept Jesus. And so today, they're still waiting for the Messiah. What most people don't know is that in the 17th century, this Messiah announced himself, and he was, of course, a false prophet, and his name was Sabbatai Zevi. And after a century, somebody called Jacob Frank will say he's the reincarnation of Sabbatai Zevi, and he will also bring Jewish people astray into the wrong direction. And unfortunately, the Sabbatean Frankists then became the backbone of the present banking cartel, the Rothschild, the Goldsmith, the people, the Oppenheimer.
Yeah, please. That's actually what I want to ask you is about the Jacob Frank, because just a little bit that I've been able to sort of look into in the short time that I've had to research this. Yeah, I'd like to actually know about Jacob Frank, right? And why is that his legacy so controversial?
Okay.
Actually, because
I have some problems in hearing you. There is,
you know, the
yes, it seems like your video connection is breaking up.
Yeah, it's okay. I'll try and work around that. Because, you know, we're seeing, Leo, so much around Israel at the moment and all of that stuff happening there. I'll fix my camera now. Why, you know, there's just so much going on. I'm here, you know, I listen to stuff. I try and keep myself informed about what's going on. There are just so many atrocities occurring on both sides of this war. What's been happening recently in South Africa, there's a huge influx of Jewish people suddenly coming to South Africa. And no one was really sure why that is, because the South African government supports Palestine. We know that. So the confusion is, why is there so many people, Jewish people particularly? I mean, I'm not anti-Semite. I'm just observing what's going on coming into this country. Then I watch a podcast by this Jewish woman. Gosh, I forget her name now. Someone Weiss, I think. Weiss, a woman. That's her surname. And speaking about literally doing ethnic cleansing. She calls it that herself, literally doing ethnic cleansing from this huge entire area. And then she was asked, well, what about the people that are currently in, you know, the Palestinians? No, they must go to Africa. She mentions Africa and Canada are wide open for them. So I'm wondering, what is this going on? You know, there's a lot of talk about Trump and his involvement with the Rothschilds, and the Rothschilds that literally are the ones who pretty much own Israel. So therefore, a lot of...
Like I explain in my book, the Rothschild are just part of the banking cartel, which is very vast. The Sabbatean Frankists have a vast banking cartel made of many different families, families that have been very influential. I mean, just to name one, we can name the Schiff family. The Schiff family, for example, was a family critical also in the financing that brought down the Tsar and the takeover by the Soviets. Leon Trotsky, of course, received funding. But, I mean, this is only... when we are discussing this, we have to understand it's not a race. It's an ideology and a sect behind it that made possible for the establishment of Israel. And I actually, in the book, show all the passages that, you know, with the receipts, I mean, with the relevant documents and the academic sources that can't be debunked. So in a way here, what I'm saying is that, of course, you are completely right in condemning that woman, which is a typical product of a revisionist Zionism. But at the same time, you have also the labor Zionists, which have always been very much linked to the Rothschild. And the Rothschilds, like I said, they are not the only ones, because when Jacob Frank, and this is why we have to go back to Jacob Frank to explain a little bit to our viewers the whole story. Jacob Frank is born in 1726. He dies in 1791, and he was born in what is today's Ukraine. You see, back in those days, there were different borders. Ukraine didn't even exist. Most of it, part of it was in the hands of Poland. Then you had, of course, various other states. Everything was known as Podolia for a period of time, or as the Lithuanian-Polish Commonwealth before that. There were different moments in history in which the borders were not the ones we know today. But one thing we know for sure is that the Ashkenazi Jews that were based in those territories, they were severely affected by this heresy that they tried to fight, though, because my book then explains how there was an internal fight. And so that's why we don't have to generalize or say, oh, the Khazarians. And I explain also that the Khazarian is, of course, with DNA studies and everything, is often discussed, but is never really understood that they are not a race. They were simply a kingdom that embraced Judaism. So they can't have a DNA, a Khazarian. The Ashkenazi, of course, like the Sephardi Jews, like the Yemeni Jews or the Ethiopian Jews, have a DNA connected to what is the Jewish bloodline. But the bloodlines. But in my book, what I try to explain here is the problem that this sect created for Judaism. I mean, the worst enemy of the Jews is the Jews, unfortunately. When, for example, I have, as you know, criticized and made books about topics like the Jesuits. The Jesuits are in this pyramid of power, you know, where you have all the secret societies we commonly refer to as the Illuminati. And you have the Jesuits and you have the Sabbatean Frankists. I never really wrote a book about the Sabbatean Frankists. I often mention them in volume 4, in volume 7, and occasionally in other books I wrote, volume 9, and even in volume 12 in relation to the Jesuits. But with this book, I wanted to explain, first of all, that Jeffrey Epstein was the product of all this. When we say Jeffrey Epstein was working for the Jewish intelligence, it was the Jewish intelligence that was working for the Sabbatean Frankists. When you had a former prime minister visiting many times Little St. James, that means that it was like a routine. But people don't know that from the early stages of Jeffrey Epstein, there were people of Sabbatean Frankist descent. And I demonstrate that with Donald Barr. Donald Barr, who was also the author of a book called Space Relations, which actually transmits in a sci-fi version the teachings of Sabbatean Frankism, he published that book a year before employing Jeffrey Epstein, who didn't have a degree, as a math professor and a scientist professor for the Dalton School, which is a very, elite school in New York, preppy, kind of school in New York. And people still wondering, why did Donald Barr, the father, by the way, of the head of the DOJ, employ this guy? Because when you go, on the internet and you go it superficially, you would say, oh, well, Donald Barr is a Catholic. No. You have to study his family. He converted from Judaism to Catholicism in a late age, which is something only the Sabbatean Frankists do, and brought up William Barr, the future head of the DOJ in the Catholic faith, like the Sabbatean Frankists do. Because you see, Sabbatai Zevi was in the 17th century the initiator of this heresy. Then you had this heresy started in the Middle East and Turkey. Okay? In Smyrna, modern Izmir. And in the rabbinical school there, this guy was formed called Shabbatai Zevi. At that point in history, and we are talking about the 17th century, not the 18th century, which saw the rise of Jacob Frank, the Jews didn't necessarily want to go back to Israel. The Jews living in Israel were living quite peacefully along with the Muslims, the Christians, for a very long time during the Ottoman Empire. Like I explained in volume 10 of my Confessions, which I know you read, there was a relative amount of peace when the Ottoman Empire was around. But then the Ottoman Empire was brought down by those forces, Masonic and also Sabbatean Frankist, that brought the Ottoman Empire to the ground to then modernize it with the Young Turks and then, of course, Ataturk and the foundation of modern Turkey. But before all this happened, there was a guy called Shabbatai Zevi. And the father of Shabbatai Zevi was Mordechai Zevi. And people say, who the heck is Mordechai Zevi? Because nobody talks about him and nobody even knows about him. So my research had to go really deep into the archives of Judaism, because Mordechai Zevi was working for the English people, who at that time were ruled by Oliver Cromwell, by the Puritans. And the Puritans had this idea that the Jews had to be brought back to Israel. So you see, it doesn't start with the Jews here. It starts with the English, who were so fixated with the whole thing that they created this belief in British Israelism, which means that they believe they are the lost tribe of Israel, which is another thing that was concocted out of pure thin air by the secretary of Oliver Cromwell, a guy called Sadler. But having said this, the inspiration for modern Zionism starts 5 centuries ago within puritanical thought, the same puritanical thought that gave us those Puritans who came with the Mayflower here to America. And their idea was simply to not necessarily like the Jews or embrace Judaism, but to simply push them back to their land so the prophecies could materialize. Do we know that? Are people realizing that today? They realize it when they see that the Christian Zionists in America are always, of course, on the side of Israel. But everybody has been played by this ancient Jewish sect that pre-existed actually the Sabbatean Frankists, because it goes all the way back to Moses when he went out of Egypt and some Egyptian magicians and witch doctors and stuff followed him and then pushed his people to worship the golden calf, which really made Moses crazy. In fact, he just broke the whole thing down. The Ten Commandments say, you're a bunch of fools. But then they realized their sin, but still, the Erev Rav, this group, this multitude of people who were not of Jewish origin, infiltrated Judaism from the very early start. Now, like I said, to bring people to realize that this problem is not the Jewish people, but is a specific ideology and religion, you need to really eviscerate and analyze every side of, the very creation of Israel. In the creation of Israel, I mean, if I have it here, maybe I can show it to you, comes from a guy called Theodor Herzl. Let's see if I have here this is the Encyclopedia of Zionism and Israel. Okay. Now, the guy who founded basically the Zionist movement as we know it was this guy here, Theodor Herzl. Now Theodor Herzl was a typical Sabbatean Frankist product. He actually talks about Shabbatai Zevi in his novel, which is dedicated to this utopic future Israel, which sees basically also the mention of Shabbatai Zevi. But also it shows that the Jews at the time, at the end of the 19th century, were everything but a unified force. You see, they were the secularized Jews, the ones that had worked with the Illuminati, the Freemasons, who wanted to be respectable. They were the ones that at that point were in charge of the banking system. And of course, we can talk about the Rothschild, the Warburg, the Schiff, the Goldsmith. We can go for a long line. It's not only the Rothschild. The Rothschild is just the tip of the spear, the Oppenheim.
Right.
And it goes down. And then, of course, diamonds, South Africa, gold. and it's all. And so people, of course, when they see what is happening today, it's very easy to then embrace the Nick Fuentes of the situation, or simply the guy who gives you the easy solution. It's the Jews, it's the Jews. Instead, in my book, I explain you which Jews, which is a very different thing. When Jeffrey Epstein was given that possibility in the middle of the 70s, he started to collaborate, of course, with the Sabbatean Frankist sect that gave him access to immense wealth and privileges that will help him out. Lex Wexner, the guy who, of course, founded Victoria, who took over and then made popular Victoria's Secret, gave him that incredible building filled with cameras and everything. It wasn't Jeffrey Epstein who created Jeffrey Epstein. It was people like Les Wexner. And Les Wexner is somebody who nobody knows anything about. And when in 1991, Lex Wexner founded the Mega Group, a Jewish study group, in which there were the elite of the Sabbatean Frankists in America, including people like Steven Spielberg. Well, that is where we're going with this book. We're not generalizing here. This book is about fighting anti-Semitism and demonstrating that the Jews are victims of a plot within Judaism that is rarely discussed simply because the rabbis don't want to ruin the reputation of the rabbinical schools, which have all been infiltrated. Just to give you an idea, today, the biggest branch of Judaism here in the United States is Reform Judaism. And people will say, what is Reform Judaism? It's liberal progressive Judaism, which decides to believe in certain Mosaic laws, and in certain others, they simply don't want to even discuss them. Well, if Moses came back, he will curse them all to the pits of hell. Because when the Mosaic laws were given, let's be very clear about the Mosaic laws, they were given without possibility of discussion. When you have rabbis who say, you can't believe in this one, you cannot believe in this. We have 10 Mosaic laws here, the 10 commandments. Do you know the 10 commandments? Let's read them, because we can read them if you want. And you will see that there is rabbis today who deliberately decide to not believe certain commandments. Well, in that case, why don't they ditch their religion altogether? Because they are sinning against their own faith. And because they are the people of God, they have a certain responsibility. Their curse is double when you are God's child, in the sense you have a mission. I'm not saying they are privileged in any way, shape, or form. That's why I explain this in this book. We don't have to view that as a privilege, but rather as a responsibility. If God has given you a mission to stand in front of other nations, to do a certain thing, and you don't do it, the responsibility is much stronger. So in my book, I explain how they helped the rise of Jeffrey Epstein. There was also the father of Ghislaine Maxwell involved. He was a dear friend of Lex Wexner and other people that later on will found the Mega Group. And people simply don't have a clue. Who is this guy, Robert Maxwell? A man of mystery, a man who suddenly dies on his yacht, dedicated to Lady Ghislaine, to Ghislaine, her daughter. But people don't know that this guy is not actually Robert Maxwell. Robert Maxwell is a concocted name. You know the real name of Robert Maxwell? It's not Robert Maxwell. Actually, in my book, I show an image which is very interesting, and I think you should show to your audience. Let me see if I can share it with you, because it would be of great help to understand certain elements of the Jeffrey Epstein story. If I can manage to find it, but if I can't, which seems to be here, let me see. No, it's it was basically. I'm just seeing. Yeah, I have it here. It's an image that I want to show you, which of a young, very young Robert Maxwell and Jacob Frank, and you tell me what you see, just with your eyes, okay? And then you give me your opinion. Here it is. You have it on the thing. You can bring it up. Okay, so the one on the left is the father of Ghislaine Maxwell, Robert Maxwell. The one on the right is Jacob Frank. What do you see here? Two people that look very much alike.
Could be the same person. Yeah, yes. Could be the same person.
Now, in Sabbatean Frankism, there is a firm belief in reincarnation. And when you are reincarnated, you are on a mission for the Sabbatean Frankist sect. Now, Robert Maxwell was born in what is modern-day Ukraine. His real name is Jan Ludwig Hyman Benjamin Hock. His family goes back to Jacob Frank and to the worship, the heretical worship that Jacob Frank imposed to his followers, who then also invited them to embrace at times Christianity by marrying the Catholic faith or embracing the Catholic faith. He was of Jewish descent. He escaped the Nazi occupation in his native Czechoslovakia, but then he became an international man of mystery. He started to work for the British intelligence. Who was in charge of the British intelligence at the time? Question. Answer. A guy called Maxwell Knight. And that's why he decided to take the surname Maxwell. And Maxwell Knight was a friend of Aleister Crowley. And Aleister Crowley was a member of the OTO. And the OTO was founded by the Sabbatean Frankists of the Asiatic Brethren. And this is documents that are official. Maxwell Knight became the British spy master that involved Robert Maxwell. And so he dedicated his new surname in his newfound country, where he was naturalized, of England, of United Kingdom, to his spy master. And that's it. I mean, people don't know that. But when you wake up to this reality, it starts to become really sick. And so my book is offering you really by the end of the book, you arrive to the conclusion that the system is rigged and there is nothing you can do about it. If you don't want to give up your credit cards, your banks, your everything, because they're all part of the system which is rigged.
Oh, yeah. Definitely.
And
personally, I think...
Please.
Carry on.
No, please carry on.
No, go ahead. We've got a lag here. We've got a lag. So please carry on. Yeah, sorry.
Okay. I decided also to connect this book to Frankenstein. It seems pretty obvious, no? with Jeffrey Epstein offers Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. And people, of course, know very much about the fact that Mary Shelley was inspired by an alchemist and by crazy alchemists doing experiments, and that basically Frankenstein is something that in a way comes from this alchemical background, which in a way is connected to Judaism. But in reality, like recent studies have confirmed, Frankenstein is inspired by the Golem, is inspired by Jacob Frank, because the very name Frankenstein is based on Jacob Frank. And so in my book, I bring out this connection, which is quite incredible. And so who built Jeffrey Epstein from scratch? Who brought him to life like the Frankenstein monster? And at the same time, who permitted him to be like his creator, Victor Frankenstein, the mad scientist? Because that was the other side of Jeffrey Epstein, the side that made experiments, that inspired the creation of Sophia the robot, that wanted to inseminate the world with his DNA. And I repeat, this is the first and unique take on the Jeffrey Epstein saga that will really be critical for a complete understanding. We recently had the publication, of course, of Virginia Giuffre's memoir, and it's a very important testimony. But she was limited even by her ghost author in what she could also rely in terms of names. However, if you go into the depositions to the FBI, the actual official testimonies that were made by Virginia Giuffre, then you can eventually compare very easily and realize that, for example, the famous prime minister she's talking about is Ehud Barak, a socialist, progressive, laborist prime minister of Israel, who represents everything that is wrong in reform and progressive and liberal Judaism. So also this link that we have, between the British royals and the Sabbatean Frankists. I mean, we're talking about a link that goes back centuries almost, because already in the 19th century, the Rothschilds started to marry with the British aristocracy and mixing up. Because Jacob Frank, at one point, when you see Shabbatai Zevi in 1666 converted to Islam, at that point, half of the Jewish world who was following all over Europe said, this guy's a joke. But there was still a very big number of Jews who said, we're going to be like him. We're going to convert outwards to Islam and keep this whole Sabbatean faith going on, which is a heresy made up of a twisted interpretation of Lurianic Kabbalah, of the actual Torah. They don't believe in the written Torah. They have their own sick version of it, which we can eventually discuss. And so they became a force very much within the Middle East. Their main bases were in Salonika, which is Thessaloniki today, and of course in the Ottoman Empire, in Izmir, where Jacob Frank came from, but also they maintained a very strong position in Gaza, because Nathan of Gaza was a little bit like the St. John the Baptist of the Sabbatean faith. He was the one who promoted Shabbatai Zevi as a Messiah after he announced himself to the Jewish world. But then they were, when in 1666 they converted to Islam, they were known as the Domme. And the Domme became very relevant within the merchants and within the banking system, especially because Thessaloniki was a very important center at the time. Jacob Frank and his family, who were instead in modern-day Ukraine, back then Poland, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, whatever, they were pushed to go to Thessaloniki because the uncle was caught with Sabbatean writings that were deemed dangerous, both by the Jewish community and by the Christian, because you see, the Jewish community didn't want this heresy to spread. In any case, Jacob Frank, young Jacob Frank, goes to Thessaloniki, and then he finds out that, he is the chosen one. He is the successor of Shabbatai Zevi. In the meantime, there had been another successor of Shabbatai Zevi known as Baruch Russo, but he wanted to stay local to the Domme, to the Turkish Middle Eastern Domme. Instead, Jacob Frank, after he was nominated as the successor, he left Thessaloniki under pressure also from the local authorities. And he had the idea of saying, who cares about limiting this whole thing to the Islamic world? Let's make it a thing in the Catholic world. Let's ally with the Jesuits, who were very strong in Podolia. in those areas of Eastern Europe. And then at that point, Jacob Frank brought to the Catholic Church 20,000 Jewish converts ready to convert, even if they stayed secretly Sabbatean. And that was the beginning of the expansions of the Sabbatean Frankists within the Catholic world and within the Christian world. Because at that point, the center of Sabbatean Frankists, it was Prague, Vienna. It moved from Eastern Europe into Europe. And, when Jacob Frank arrived in Frankfurt, the Rothschild received him as a king. He was like the king. All the future banking families of Europe embraced him like he was the real Messiah. And at that point, he became a threat even for the Catholic Church when he started to collaborate, because then there is elements of the story, of course, that I'm going to keep for myself so people can have them when they read the actual book. But the cousin of the mother of Jacob Frank, the son, Moses Dobruska, became the super secret agent who also embraced the foundation of this new Masonic Illuminati body called the Asiatic Brethren. And at that point, they started to spread. For the first time, the Jews could enter lodges of a new Masonic body, Illuminati, connected also to the Illuminati. In Frankfurt, of course, the Rothschild financed this lodge very much. And this creation, which was connected, by the way, with also the aristocracy, because at that point, when a Sabbatean Frankist Jew will embrace Catholicism, he will take on the name of his godfather. And for that reason, they were clever. When they saw Jacob Frank, initially wanted them only to marry with each other, but to spread the whole thing in a way that they couldn't be detected, because the rabbinical authorities started to wonder what was happening. And even the Christian authorities, the Inquisition, was wondering what was happening with these people. Were they really Catholics? Were they just Jews pretending to be Catholics? On the other side, the Jews would say, these are not real Jews, they're converting to Catholicism. So what happened was that Jacob Frank said, okay, guys, initially he didn't want them to marry outside of their circle, of the sectarian circle, but then then they saw the fact they could take over the Catholic, royal, and noble families of Europe by simply embracing the surname of their Catholic godfather. So they went to the most important families in Europe and they said, I want to convert to Catholicism, to the black nobility close to the Vatican, and said, and I will take on your surname. Oh yeah, great, we love you. In any case, this meant that soon all the Catholic families, noble, aristocratic, were taken over. And then the same thing happened with the British Anglican nobility. The Rothschilds arrived in England, as well as the Goldsmith and other families, and they started to marry with the English nobility. And then they became part of it. And then they promoted the idea, like Israeli and other people, that the Jewish people had to go back to Israel. And who was in charge of Israel before the creation of Israel, Chantelle? England. It was a British protectorate. And who brought down the Ottoman Empire that facilitated that? The Sabbatean Frankists. So you see, it's all connected. And in the end, the first victims, though, the ones that I really care for, are the victims of that monstrosity that was the Holocaust. Because the Holocaust is a monstrosity. And anybody who denies it is a criminal. But how did we get to the Holocaust? And why the Sabbatean Frankists wanted millions of Jews to die in that awful way in the Shoah? Because the Sabbatean Frankists hate all other kinds of Jews who don't embrace their heresy. So they were very happy of giving Hitler, who, by the way, was a product himself of the Sabbatean Frankists, because he was concocted and born after a ritual in 1888 made by the Sabbatean Frankists. He's of Jewish descent, yes, of Sabbatean Frankist descent. Adolf Hitler, the worst enemy of Judaism, is a Jew. See, that is really what Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan, said. The best kind of Satanist is the satanic Jew. And Anton LaVey was Anton Levi. And where did his family come from? From Thessaloniki. They were Sabbatean Frankists. Actually Sabbatean, more than Frankist. So you see, you have Alistair Crowley, you have Anton LaVey, you have Madame Blavatsky, who went to Cairo and met with Max Theon, who was a Sabbatean Frankist from Poland, and got initiated into the Brotherhood of Luxor. And then she created the Theosophical Society. You have Eliphas Levi, like I show in this book, who became the disciple of a leading Sabbatean Frankist and then gave up on his Catholic faith to become an occultist and a Sabbatean Frankist. And he actually promoted the word, the word that we all know, occultism. So without the Sabbatean Frankists, you will not have modern Satanism as we know it, the Theosophical Society, Alistair Crowley, every single thing that is wrong in our society. I leave it to you for the next question.
Sorry, I've just, there's a bit of a lag here and I don't always hear everything you're saying. So that's also why I'm kind of just letting you go. Interesting. Okay. You were talking earlier on about the building of the Frankist Monster, and you kind of brought the whole Frankenstein thing into the Jeffrey Epstein yes. Image, because I've been thinking for a long time, and well, let me start by saying as well, one of the previous survivors of Epstein survivors was a South African girl, Juliet Bryant, that I interviewed a few months ago. She was for over a period of 18 months trafficked by Epstein, right? And Bill Clinton and friends. So she was at the time the only person I'd heard who'd spoken about Epstein having laboratories. She woke up in a laboratory when they were doing tests on her. So she was adamant about that. At that stage, I hadn't heard about that before. And since then, a lot more of that information has come out. So it would make a lot of sense to me as well. And then also, when we've done decodes with Jesse Zabotar on Epstein Island, and you're looking at all the satanic symbolism and the way that they, the rituals and stuff that they're doing there, it's very obvious that Epstein Island was being used for a hell of a lot more than just girls being trapped, You
see, here is in Little St. James. This used to be the temple. Yeah. Okay, now it's been repainted in white because they want to do some kind of tourist location there. I don't know. They want to transform the island, re-commercialize it. But it was inspired by this. See? And you know what is that? That is a bathhouse in Aleppo, Syria, used by the Dome, the Sabbateans.
Right.
So it's like, what you said is perfectly aligned with what is written in this book. The fact that there was, of course, that symbolism, but then we need to go deeper. And that's why this book goes deeper into showing you why we have that symbolism, what kind of symbolism. The fact that Jeffrey Epstein was like Dr. Frankenstein is very important, because let's not forget one thing. Dr. Frankenstein, you read the novel Frankenstein? Mary Shelley's novel, if you read it, you find a very important detail. Where did Dr. Frankenstein go to school? Ingolstadt, Bavaria, the university where the Illuminati were founded. Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And that is
Very
only scratching
Bavarian.
the surface. You see, the modern Prometheus, because that is also the title of Frankenstein, is in a way, and it's not by accident, like Rabbi Antelman, the late Rabbi Antelman said, the concept of the Sabbatean Frankist was preserved, not by accident, in the novel Frankenstein, which deals with the creation of the Frankist monster. The word Frank stands for Jacob Frank, the founder of the Frankists. The EN is an anglicized way, an abbreviation of the three-letter Hebrew word Ain. So Frankenstein or Jeffrey Epstein, which means I in the Jewish tradition. And then the first letter, the N, is for the last. And Stein in German means stone. So this is like a symbol. And it has to be, you see, people have to understand that today's Kabbalah is very popular, but it's also popular for the Hasidic Jews. The Hasidic Jews were born as a reaction to Sabbatean Frankism. When the Jewish community saw what Sabbatean Frankists were doing, they tried to fight it, especially the Ashkenazis. And when they couldn't fight it anymore, they established what is now known as one of the most important groups within Orthodox Judaism, the Hasidic Jews. And the Hasidic Jews go back to that Kabbalah, which is the Lurianic Kabbalah, which is very important because it goes back to a gentleman who was inspirational even for Shabbatai Zev. You see, the thing is that the Sabbatean Frankists picked up on the Kabbalistic knowledge and made it and deviated it. It's a little bit like putting the pentagram upside down, or let's say for the Christians, the Satanists, when they recite the Mass backwards. And at that point, the Lurianic Kabbalah became a tool in a way. So in the 16th century, we had this mystical system developed by this rabbi, who was Isaac Luria. And this concept was then picked up by the Sabbateans, by Shabbatai Zevi, who then said, we can do redemption through sin, because in the sparkles of sin, in our twisted and perverse rituals of sexual magic, orgies, and so on, we can then find God. It's a completely perverted and demented way of doing things. It's, of course, satanic, and it goes against... Totally satanic. But in fact, in my book...
Sorry, Leo, in the Talmud, right? I mean, it's well documented that it's okay. I mean, I think they make reference to the fact that they believe Jesus is burning in a feces, a hell feces, or something like that.
First of all, we have to understand one thing. Yeah, but I want to interrupt you here. The Talmud, it depends which Talmud you're talking about, because it's like you are going into a specific version of the Talmud rather than the Talmud as a generalized thing. Now,
I'm not a theologist. I'm not a theologist in terms of that, but a lot of what I've been seeing and in my research, I'm looking, because obviously this whole it's disturbing what's going on, right?
Yeah, but
so I'm seeing a lot of
the Talmud is a teaching, an instruction that is central to rabbinical Judaism, which is the Jewish Bible, the Tanakh, and of course the core of it, which is the Torah. But because there is, it's almost like when we discussed Islam with volume 10 of my Confessions, how many versions there is really of the Quran and of the way you interpret the Quran is open. There is not a centralized system like the Vatican, who initially said, this is the Bible and this is it. Then, of course, it was rediscussed maybe by the King James Bible, which is the only version that puts into discussion certain things. But that's it. So when you have the oral Torah and the Mishnah, and the Torah is very important to understand. The Sabbatean Frankists, what they did, there is this first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, which is what we call the Old Testament, and it's the Pentateuch. I mean, you have basically the Pentateuch. And what happens is that in this book, you have, of course, all those teachings which most Christians agree with and which most Jews agree with. But then Sabbatean Frankists said that wasn't the real Torah. The real Torah was something different, and the interpretation was completely different. And it was a rabbi, which was called the Rabbi of the Free Communities, Rabbi Eshutz. He was a very known rabbi at the time, and he's still respected, and nobody still dares to criticize him, though it's demonstrated that he had embraced the Sabbatean Frankist faith and that he had published a book. This book became the heretical base for all their crazy interpretations of the Bible. Suddenly, for these people, King David didn't go to the mountain to talk with a spy because his son wanted to take over the show. No, it was about an homosexual act of King David on the mountain. I mean, there's some pretty scary stuff in this heretical view, sharing your own wives. And this whole perverted knowledge which was pushed within the rabbinical communities became the base for a lot of... But when you talk about the Talmud, of course you have the classical Talmud, but then you have other version, is a commentary on the Mishnah. So the commentary is open. It's not a unified commentary. And if there is a rabbi who says Jesus has to be put into the thing because he hates Jesus, that is where you get your information. So we have to always be very careful. You see, that's why I really took a few years before writing this book. And I took the inspiration from the Jeffrey Epstein saga to then develop my most compelling synthetic study on this heresy within Judaism. Because it's important then that this book is not debunked by the rabbinical sources which I'm criticizing. It's a little bit like 2000 years. Jesus went in front of the Synhedrion, went in front of these rabbis. He challenged them. Today, like I explain in my book, there is people who say, oh, Jesus wasn't part of a rabbinical school because there is no testimonies of it. And I say in my book, who cares? He lived following a traditional interpretation of the Torah. He lived following what it is basically a Mishnah, a commentary, oral traditions about the Torah which were correct. He might have been involved with other branches that were kind of more sectarian in these days. But in any case, Jesus became a model of the perfect rabbi. And then he amplified this whole thing when, from the church of James, of the brother, we go to Paul, we go into this religion becoming embraced by the Roman Empire. Of course, we have Peter arriving in Rome. We have the beginning of Christianity. But let's never forget, Jesus was a Jew, a follower of the Jewish faith, and whoever says the contrary is obviously lying. So it's very important to understand, the differences. We have the Babylonian Talmud,
it states quite clearly. It states quite clearly in the Talmud that a man can pretty much rape his daughter once she's old. She's 1 day older than 3.
Absolutely.
So that states quite clearly.
Absolutely. But the same thing.
It also states quite clearly that
Chantelle,
a Jewish person can steal
no,
from a Gentile.
can I say something?
And that,
The same thing
it's
can be
stuff
said,
like
yes,
that. So,
Chantelle.
yeah.
Yes, but the same thing can be said about the Quran with Muhammad, who actually slept with a 9-year-old. So these religions were the products of their time, and their time was primitive and barbarian. That's it. Because Muhammad, you think, his wife, 9-year-old, he married her when she was 6-year-old. She raped her when she was basically a 9-year-old can't have consensus sex. So you see here we have.
Asking.
So what I'm telling you is that Jesus and his faith are, of course, the one that has civilized this world. And nobody can say the contrary, because the Western world is the product of Christianity, most of all. And there is, of course, been some monstrosities even made by the Christians in his name, because that's also happened in the course of history. Or some people who had some twisted interpretation of Jesus and started their own show. Let's not forget the Mormons, the Jehovah's Witnesses, this and that. I mean, these are people that took the teachings of Jesus and started their own faith based on some kind of arbitrary interpretation or revelation by some angel or some other thing. So it's very important that
every religion has done that, Leo. That's exactly what the point I'm making. Religion is poison. Any religion is poison, because we can see how many.
I will not say that every religion is poison here. I will say one thing.
It is. Religion. Religion is poison. Christ never required worship.
Let me give you my explanation. Let me give you my explanation. The religions are the products of those prophets, of those emissaries of God. But the moment in which they spread the religion, it gets corrupted by mankind. And so you have Judaism corrupted after Moses goes, and makes his. Then you have Christianity and Jesus gets corrupted. The Council of Nicaea makes it a state religion for the empire, and suddenly a lot of the writings that talk about Jesus disappear in favor of others. You have Islam that basically, if it was ever genuine in any way, shape, or form after the death of Muhammad, then gives birth to another faction, which is the Shia faith, and then they all start to become involved in schism upon schism. But the basis of those prophets, the teachings of those religious figures are correct. The problem is corrupted by mankind, is corrupted by the men who then suddenly, when they are given, the responsibility over these religions, they corrupted. So I will say it would be unjust to say that religion is wrong, because religion is our own relationship with God. Then if you start putting a set of rules...
No, that's not religion. That's not religion. That is a belief. That is a belief or a faith. That's not what I mean when I talk about religion. I'm talking about your relationship with your creator is something very personal.
Jesus had a message, and it was an important message, and that message transformed mankind, and it made part of the world a better place. At least to my knowledge, every third world country wants to invade or enter what is the Western world, which was created on the basis of Jesus' teachings. So there must be, even every country is trying to enter, every person from wherever is trying to enter either Europe or the United States of America. Is not trying to enter their own countries. Nobody wants to go and live in communist China. Let's make it very clear. There is a level of superiority of the Judeo-Christian faith that can't be matched in those countries. Now, we know that it might be the product also of other things, but definitely we have everybody who is trying to enter the United States of America. They're not trying to enter Zimbabwe. They're not trying to enter Nigeria, where, by the way, Christians today are slaughtered. So I think that we need to understand.
They're entering South Africa.
Well,
by the thousands every day.
Of course, it might be, but I mean, South Africa was, to my knowledge, even if very debatable, the forms of Christianity that spread there. But of course, you had the Church of England that made it a Christian place. So now, the fact that we have today this conflict within the Abrahamic faith, it demonstrates, of course, what you said, the religion, organized religion, I would say. I would differentiate it by saying organized religion. It's terrible because organized religion is based, it's the worst. So in my books, if you think about it, I go after organized religion because it's their, you can't write books on people who are disorganized and their own beliefs. That's their own thing with God. But when it comes to their organized religion, that's why this book goes after the synagogues, after those rabbis who have compromised. Just like volume 12 goes after the Jesuits and what they have done to the Catholic Church, or the volume 10 goes after all the various branches of Islam that were corrupted by greed and power. That is the problem. But in reality, potentially, if we followed the teachings of these religious teachers or prophets, we should live all better, no? Because their teachings in their original form are good. You can embrace what Jesus said or what Moses said or what another figure said, which makes sense. Even some words in the Quran might make sense. But then, when you actually...
The Quran is actually beautiful.
Yeah.
I mean, if you read the Quran and the teachings, it's actually beautiful. But there again, every one of the scripture books, there's a lot of beauty in,
And then there is that element of corruption. There is that element of corruption.
There's always the element of corruption. And there's always,
for example, in the Quran,
interpretation.
In the Quran, for example, you have parts in which, Christians and Jews are recognized, but they are restricted, and then they're forced basically at that point, they're recognized because they're recognized as people of the book. But then, that meant that, for example, within the Ottoman Empire, they were sanctioned after a special form of tax that they had to pay because they didn't embrace whatever was, the Allah and the faith of Muhammad. So, or the same can be said, like you said, in versions of the Talmud that can be critical of Jesus, or the same can be said for other forms that are maybe critical of, because it becomes like a competition. It becomes almost like a soccer match in which, my team is better than your team. But in reality, I think that organized religion, like we stated today, has a lot of limits. And so it's not really connected to the faith of the people.
Well, I fully agree with what, this is my philosophy, and sorry, I'm not sure how to pronounce your name, Cyan. Dharma in Vedas, which means knowledge, means the internal original nature of the soul, love and knowledge of God. Share that. That's exactly what Jesus came to share. And you see, that's the thing, the way I see it. Jesus came to teach love. Jesus never ever require anyone worship him, ever. That was something these idiots decided to do when they
success. Yes, sure. But in fact, the Church of James, meaning his brother, meaning the very original nucleus of Christianity, of him and his followers, were then hijacked by St. Paul, who brought a different form of Christianity, who then, of course, was made more and more popular. So then it would be embraced by the empire and would be made a state religion. The moment in which you make it a state religion, that, of course, went through a series of compromises. So you are completely right in stating that. But in the end, we are a product of our past. And so we like to acknowledge what has happened in the past and learn from our mistakes and maybe write a better future. Well, now, I hope that people realize that, you know, that there is beauty in everything. Like we said, there is beauty in the Quran, there is beauty in the Torah, there is beauty in the Gospels, there is beauty in all the products of that original Abrahamic faith that in fact came from Abraham. So it is from that moment onwards that things started to, you know, break up between different tribes, different people, different ways of viewing God. And then in the end, it becomes even a conflict, you know, a conflict that can be, but we have to be very honest.
That's the problem. That's the problem, because religion has been used as such a means of control. It's exactly how the church controls, politics control, and the upper echelon who have the control use that. They use it to divide and conquer. They always have, and they always will, which is why I say, you know, when we look at so many different versions of the Quran or the Talmud or the Holy Bible, whatever, it's a whole lot of nonsense. When we go to the original teachings of what Jesus and other leaders before that too, the Buddha, for example, when we go to those essence teachings,
well, I mean, we could, you know, we could say that, for example, like Jeremiah said that if we go back to the Genesis, you know, we can see in the Genesis some reflections of the Book of the Dead from the ancient Egyptians. We can see that the Book of the Dead of the Bardo Todol of the Tibetans has also similarities. We see that in the afterlife, you have to go through a series of acts to then perfectionate yourself and eventually unify with that eternal light. And so we know that we are all in front of a common factor when we have death. Death is the ultimate leveler of all this. So I think that in a lifetime we can have beliefs, but in the end, we need to prepare ourselves with God for the afterlife.
And the soul lives on. And I truly believe that God chooses for us to have ultimate joy while we're living in our human bodies. And that is what I believe, what Jesus was talking about, heaven on earth. So the soul is eternal, the body is temporary. When we leave our body, the soul obviously continues on its spiritual journey, some to heaven, some to hell, right? Depending on what your actions you've taken in this life. And so, in my opinion, you know, is when we commit sin, it's forgetting that. It's forgetting we belong to God. It's forgetting that we are ultimately a creation of God's love. And the opposite of love is fear. So when we fear and when we forget that, we move into the opposite, where we go into, and I mean, we understand, you know, when we look at a whole lot of spiritual teachings, there's the light side and there's the dark side.
Well, in
there's
fact,
light and there's shadow.
I mean, as we are moving towards the end of the show, I would like to, in fact, mention that dark side which inspired people like Jeffrey Epstein. In my book, I, in fact, also discuss the fact that Jeffrey Epstein thought of Ghislaine Maxwell not simply as a lover and then as an associate, but as the Shekinah. The Shekinah is a concept that, of course, we all know is very important in Judaism, is a female side or aspect of God. But Jacob Frank saw his daughter Eve Frank as the representation of this Shekinah, this Holy Mary. Imagine that, just so people can understand, at one point, Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell got a private audience with Pope John Paul II, who is now a saint. And so I explain in this book why they were received, why they were personally blessed, and the connection that the Sabbatean Frankists have with Poland, which is very strong historically, culturally, and even religiously, because Jacob Frank was arrested and placed in that monastery, which is the center ground for the worship of the Black Mary, which the Madonna of Czestochowa, which was the most worshipped form of the Holy Mary by John Paul II. So people don't know about these connections between the Sabbatean Frankists and the Catholic Church, and of course, between Jacob Frank and the future Pope John Paul II. And I think that by learning this, they will understand better why this John Paul II suddenly gives an audience to Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, which is outrageous. I mean, I have not seen, to my knowledge, any journalist or any author addressing the fact that the future saint of the Catholic Church received these two people in the Vatican in private audience. It's almost like they want to simply ignore this whole thing, which is instead very relevant.
Well, I think it would seem obvious to me why they would, because the Vatican and the royals and everything is all mixed. They're really all one and the same thing.
Well, they are all one and the same thing, but like I explained, in fact, the connection goes also with the Sabbatean Frankist, which is a sectarian connection, which then once it... So it's about simply making clarity and explaining, of course, further, like we have done in our past shows with other books, the fact that there is corruption, of course, in organized religion, but that in the end, what we have always called the Illuminati or the secret societies of the upper echelons, the elite, seems to always use these religions to manipulate the masses, while they themselves have a completely twisted interpretation of these faiths and of these religions.
I agree, and I mean, at the end of the day, and I absolutely disagree with someone's comment saying only the Bible has pure words. Absolute nonsense. If you think the Bible is not deceiving you as well, then you're mistaken. All of these religious books, they'll give you 70% this and maybe...
Yeah, but Chantelle, I think that more than the Bible deceiving is the interpretation of the Bible that is deceiving. Because like you said,
that's the point.
Yeah, in relation to, for example, the Quran, and it can be stated in relation to the Torah, the interpretation of something can be deceiving. If I stand on the pulpit, I open the Bible, and I start saying this and this, and then I start putting words in the mouth of God or of his emissaries and interpret it in a twisted way that simply plays into my own if I have some kind of purpose, and this purpose is criminal, but then, you use the Bible to make it legitimate, the problem is not about the Bible, but is of the person who is actually giving us this twisted interpretation. So we go back to the fact that the emissaries, the original prophets of God might have actually attempted to give us some knowledge, but that knowledge then is corrupt by the way we interpret it and relate to the people in the form of organized religion.
It's been translated so many times, Leo, and it's been translated to people's perception of what they choose it to be. And let's just say the King James Bible is written by King James, who is a known Satanist and a cannibal, and it's copyrighted by the royal family. I don't think so. And there's a lot of things in the Bible, I mean, if we're looking at the Old Testament and the New Testament, that there's some very muddy waters there that, again, it's so true. I think so many things have been interpreted way too literally that make Christians not understand the true power and presence of God that lives within us all. So it's become an incredible weapon of judgment and isolation. That's what in the majority of the way that I've seen, and the world. If we see the world right now with religion, it's clear religion sucks in the way that it's been taught, right? And the way people have understood it.
But at the same time, just like the Sabbatean Frankists pushed what we know as the Jewish Enlightenment and later on pushed the Jews to become more secularized, and the same thing can be said within Christianity. At the same time, the product of a non-religious society, like we see, for example, in Europe today, where Christianity is pushed aside and socialism and Islam suddenly is treated, with white gloves. Well, I don't think the result is positive, because in communist China, where you don't have religion, and when the religion is a state-controlled affair, I don't think is a positive thing. People can't even have the freedom of worship what they want without being controlled by the state. And so I think that, you have to be very careful, because this is a balance, and once you lose that balance, you then support the non-religious side of things, which brings us inevitably to atheism, which is itself almost a step towards, almost Satanism in itself, because today Satanists, most of them don't believe in Satan. They simply claim Satan is a symbol for them. So we have to be very careful about leaving our society godless. We need to understand that in the end, God is something that has to have a priority in our life. And when we are pushing, of course, these religions are all corrupt, so they're very easy to attack. But then the result of it is a godless society. So we need to find a balance here. It's not going to be easy. We hope that things will change, that God will help a new revelation, a powerful revelation in a critical moment of history, to then bring people back to God. I pray for that. I don't know you, but I pray for that, because I'm very in fear of a godless society in the hands of the artificial intelligence, that we worship the AI as a god. That is my big fear. Cyber Satan.
Love is the most powerful vibration of all. Love that operates from the heart center. So it's like the Buddhists believe as well. We lead with the heart, and our brain is in the heart. And science has proved now the heart has a brain. And if you look at the energy around the heart chakra, it's 3.5 times larger than the rest of your energy centers in the body. So when we learn to love, and learning to love is so complex, because we as human beings think that we are the be all and the end all. We want them to stop eating our babies, for example. Yet how much meat do we consume every single day? We eat the babies of other species day in and day out. There's something that is revered here, which is Christian hunters. Christian and hunters should never go together. There's such a disconnect there. Our own actions show us how non-Christian we are. If we look at Jesus, what's the animal Jesus holds? The innocent lamb. Yet, what's the food we eat the most? We are hypocrites, Leo. We are hypocrites, and we don't even know it.
It's
And
definitely
that's the problem. That's the problem.
I wanted,
We're
before leaving,
hypocrites, and we don't even know it.
I see a lot of people want to address the Vatican as the most successful hunters of the world. I saw what has happened in the last few days with King Charles and the Pope coming together after 500 years, the Church of England getting back into the fold with the Vatican. I see them as two dying religions, as two religions who are losing very much their grip, at least in the Western world. But the result of it, like I said, is becoming increasingly a godless society. So in volume 12, as you know, I explained, and this is a book also that people need to get, because it's explained how the Jesuits have taken over the church, how they were actually inspired at the very foundation by the reform that was happening with the Church of England, with Martin Luther, into creating what is known as the Counter-Reformation. But today we are instead going towards a one-world religion, a topic which, as you know, I have touched in volume 7 of my confession, I've touched in volume 9 especially also, and this one-world religion is what they are working for. In volume 7, I explain how the Freemasons and the Vatican are working together towards this project. And I hope that it never comes together, but unfortunately, it seems like those anti-Christian forces, which are materializing with an antichrist, which seems more and more obvious to us, could be potentially Prince William, as his, role is pretty very central. But we had also many other candidates, of course, in the last few decades. The future doesn't look bright, let's say, but our own belief with God, like you stated, is our own personal thing, and that is what can eventually save us and could lead us to a better life, more aware of things. I thank you for your time. I have to now leave, but I want to thank you for your time to present my latest book, a book which, of course, it's a labor of love. There is a long time in the making, but in the end, I decided to take, like you said yourself, I took some time for myself, because a writer at times needs to take some time for itself. And let's hope that the people appreciate what I'm bringing here, because it's the most powerful Jewish sect in the world that nobody's talking about behind Jeffrey Epstein. And I think that once you read this book, you will realize its relevance. So thank you so much for having me on today, Chantelle, and we see each other soon, I hope.
Indeed. Thank you, Leo, very much. And everybody, the rise and fall of a Frankist Monster, Leo Zagami. That's your details are now flying across the little bottom of the screen there. So, yeah. Definitely grab the book. I'm gonna definitely grab myself a copy. And then when we chat next month again.
There is an image in particular of Jeffrey Epstein, which I put here, which was the last known pic that was made of Jeffrey Epstein. And the title that the photographer gave us for this pic, which then became very popular after his death, a pic made by a notorious photographer, Andres Serrano, is infamous and is based on the banality of evil. Evil at times is very much something that is, how you say, the banality of evil gives us the idea. Evil is not at times so incredibly amazing, it happens and it manifests, and the victims, those victims are the ones that I care for, and that's why this book is dedicated to all the victims of Jeffrey Epstein. Thank you so much. God bless you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Leo. Thank you, everybody. Take good care, and I will see you tomorrow with Jerry Marzinski. Have yourselves a beautiful Friday. And if you can't